since 2010 and the reintroduction of the Tories, have we seen a widening of the class gap, or have things really become much more equal, as they say?
Statistically, I'm sure you would be able to it would be possible to show that the class gap has widened, but I think of it more as a deepening, as a sort of just of an entrenchment of existing class gaps. There is obviously sort of widening of some measures of economic inequality. There is some apparent narrowing of some measures of economic inequality, but it is really, really obvious that when it's clear that hundreds of thousands of people are, basically on the edge of destitution, where they weren't before, where they weren't 7 years ago, it's obvious that to continue to sort of talk a talk of social mobility and talk a talk of meritocracy is actually, it's actively cruel to do that, because, when you're existing, in a state of near destitution, there is literally nothing else you can think about. How can you possibly focus? You might focus, from time to time, on dreams of a better future and dreams of what you might do, but minute by minute and hour by hour, that becomes literally impossible. So, obviously, the use of, the use of food banks, and the really, really shocking visible increase in the numbers of homeless people, which takes me right back to the late 80s and early 90s, when I was sort of in my early teens. And I remember going on a day trip to Manchester and just seeing loads and loads of homeless people around. And now you go back to Manchester again now, and it's exactly the same as it was 25 years ago. And in London, like seeing where the IMAX is on the South Bank, that's where Cardboard City was, and actually just sort of seeing the edge of Cardboard City when I was about 14 or 15, thinking, oh my God, it really exists. And, the fact that is happening again, it just absolutely shows you that there is nothing, there's nothing inevitable about these situations. There is everything that is avoidable about these situations, and they occur because of political decisions.
Some have said these policies are simply a matter of the Tories, facing up to some simple, hard truths, and they're much more capable than they would because they can face reality. Is that the case?
No, that's absolute twonk. I mean, that's the lie they get away with all the time. The thing is I grew up under the Tories. The Tories were in power from when I was 3 until when I was 21. 18 years, my entire growing up, and my entire sort of experience. Like how I see political decisions and how I see sort of politically influenced economic decisions is entirely, seen through the prism of having grown up through the Tories. And I just knew all the time when I was growing up that it was a lie. And even though, one of the things I write about in my book is the fact of when you are growing up, you don't really know any different. You're sort of, your social, your cultural, your housing realm is all that you know. And yet I remember all the time just knowing that it was unjust, what people had to go through, just to live. And again, in the 80s, it was the start of the right to buy. And so there was, when I was small, there was this kind of, I knew friends at school who, we were having crackers, and margarine for their tea because their parents had bought their house under the right to buy and quickly found how much more, because the interest rates were very high in those days, just how much more the mortgage was than the rent had been paid to the council. And yet they really felt like it was their parents felt like it was their chance at some form of mobility, and of autonomy. And yet the cost of that was having crackers, was having crackers and corned beef for tea, for years at a time. You know, and again, there was this thing about having a car as well. You know, I mean, to a lot of people, it felt like a necessity to have a car because we were on quite a sort of far flung estate. It was difficult to get to work at funny times of the day, and also, but also because the Tories were completely selling this sort of package, you know, this individualised package of own your own home, own your own car, made for life, we will accept you as full citizens. If you do neither of these things, if you rely on a bus and if you rent from the council, then, you know, you're parasitic sponges. You know, and this is being repeated. This is being absolutely repeated now. But, you know, my main beef with the former, you know, with the previous Labour government was that although they invested massively in public services and in sort of certain parts of the public realm, you know, and, you know, most obviously the NHS, they didn't really do anything to challenge that idea of, you know, you need to own your own home and own your own car to be a full citizen, because the Tories have been very, very successful previously, you know, in the 80s and early 90s, of sort of saying, oh, but this is what working class people want. Working class people want to stand on their own 2 feet and be self-sufficient, and they don't want to be looked down upon, and so on. And so Labour didn't want to challenge that because they didn't want to be seen to be unaspirational, you know. So they perpetuated that lie that there is only one form of aspiration, which is individual aspiration.
Right.
You
but
know.
of course, it's that positing of individual freedom and aspiration against the concept of a social safety net.
Mm-hmm.
So it's pairing the two off against the other.
Yeah.
How is that level of inequality reflected in housing policy today?
Well, I suppose the most obvious thing really, you know, for the last, particularly the last 5 years or so, is the refusal to invest in social housing, refusing to basically allow any new social housing to be built, extending the right to buy, you know, reducing state subsidy of housing, you know, as far as is humanly possible, you know, pushing hundreds of thousands of people and, you know, families, you know, who a generation ago totally would have been homeowners, you know, all with secure tenancies into the private rental sector. I mean, there's a strange sort of there's a sort of strange sort of remaking of certain elements of class through housing at the moment. Although I think it's quite temporary. If the government turns out to be temporary as possible, then it will be temporary. But that whole thing about having lots and lots and lots of relatively well-paid and highly educated, you know, essentially middle-class people at the mercy of private landlords for, you know, decades at a time is a totally new thing, you know, and lots of, you know, like, again, you know, thousands of working class families, you know, either in private rented accommodation or in emergency B&B type accommodation, you know, basically takes them back 50 years, you know, like 50 years of, not 50 years of progress, but any progress that might have been made in reducing sort of class differences through housing has been completely undone in the last 7 years.
Mm. So we could say that New Labour tried to push, whatever their faults were, at least tried to push to levelling the playing field, as it were, but then the Tories have come in post-austerity and
just completely undone everything, and attempted to do more damage. Yeah. It's completely scorched earth policy, yeah.
But this kind of housing policy goes all the way back to the difference between, you know, Nye Bevan's kind of housing policy and what happened with the Tories after.
And Macmillan's, yeah.
Macmillan,
yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, you know, Bevan's approach to housing was anomalous, you know, and unique for that period, you know, just for that period of time, you know, like council housing initially, you know, from the 1890s up to, you know, the end of the war, you know, was about, you know, the housing of the working class, you know, and about slum clearance, and there was quite a lot of demarcation between, you know, deserving and less deserving, or respectable and unrespectable in terms of council house allocation. You know, all the better council housing always went to the better paid and the better regard, you know, sort of the better socially regarded end of the working class, you know, and the poor quality stuff, the flats, and that went to people who were perceived as, you know, like problem families and so on. But Bevan just had this idea that if you were to build, you know, the best council housing the world had ever seen, then it would be used, it would be a service that would come to be used universally in the way that the NHS is used more or less universally. You know, he absolutely believed in universal high quality housing provision, whereas, you know, and then from the early 50s, particularly from the later 50s, you know, the Tories, because they had to an extent, you know, bought into the welfare state and consensus, you know, post-war consensus. They wanted to carry on building lots of council housing, but there was a massive reduction in quality, you know, an increase in involvement of the private sector, reduction in size, you know, went from two toilets to one toilet, you know, started subsidising local authorities to build over the fourth floor, so it went from houses with gardens increasingly to flats. Because also they sort of believe this myth that you could build at high, you know, that the only way to build at higher density would be to build flats, basically. But there is a way to build, you know, good quality and reasonably sized housing at high density. You just have to be imaginative with the way you design it. You know.
What period was your housing estate that you grew up on? What period was that built in?
It was built in the late 60s, so it was one of the sort of big greenbelt busters. It was after all the new towns were finished. You know, like, you know, places like, you know, Harlow and Skelmersdale and you know, and Cumbernauld and so on. It's fairly contemporary with those, but Richard Crossman, who was the Labour housing minister in the mid 60s, basically signed off this big chunk of the Forest of Arden in Warwickshire to allow Birmingham Council to build this massive estate of nearly 20,000 houses and flats outside the official border of Birmingham, but to be built by Birmingham Council. Yeah, so it was finished about 1970.
Are there any signs that they're going to knock it down?
Oh no! It's much too big to knock down. I mean, you can't sort of unmake an estate that big. You know.
I only asked because the estate that I grew up on, Dodders Valley, on the outskirts of London in High Barnet, they recently decided to knock that down. It's huge.
The whole lot? How big?
The whole lot. Many tower blocks.
When was it built?
1960s, 70s.
Right, and is it all tower blocks?
They've decided to, not all tower blocks, there's a
right.
lot of sort of ground floor maisonettes
in
there, but the entire estate has been levelled, and it's massive. It's a big chunk of stuff. So anyway, they decided to knock that down, and in its place they've built luxury accommodation.
In High Barnet?
In High Barnet, at the edge of High Barnet. Because just outside of High Barnet, you've got Arkley, keep going, you've got St Albans, all that kind of stuff. And all of the surrounding area in High Barnet, it's all, you know, kind of easily middle class housing, and it's a Tory constituency.
Yeah.
So a lot of the policies that they want to bring into London, previously they had tested them out in High Barnet. So High Barnet always being a bit of a testing ground for Tory policies to roll out in the rest of the area. Right. Obviously being on the outskirts of Finchley as well.
Yeah.
Anyway, they're knocking this stuff down, and they're building £400,000 luxury flats. That's the starting price. And they offered my parents to move to like Luton. They offered them to move to like various other places. My mum's like 60 years old. They've been here 35 years. Yeah. So all that kind of stuff takes place. But the entire estate now is basically a building site because they're knocking the tower blocks down one by one. Yeah. And so if you look out my mum's window or off the balcony, you can see like the fence moving over from one side to the other, where it used to be social housing and now it's private accommodation. And it's quite a scary image. I'll see if I can find it and I'll send it to you, but it's literally, you can see it half and half and the fence moving over and over and over. Never seen something more stark to do with the erosion of social housing.
Yeah. And is that estate, did that undergo a stock transfer? Was that part of a stock transfer?
I'm not entirely sure.
So is it a housing association?
Yes, I think so.
Rather than the council?
Right.
Oh my giddy aunt. But of course the thing is, it's not Tory. It's not, you know, in inner London, it's not Tory councils that are doing this kind of thing. It's Labour councils.
Exactly.
So there we go.
Yeah, I mean, this is the subject of a recent film called Dispossession.
Yeah. No, Dispossession was great. Yeah.
So, I mean, it is not just the Tories that are doing this. It's also, as you rightly point out, Labour. So is Corbyn doing enough to sort of tackle this issue within Labour? Have you seen anything on that? Or?
Having a go at Labour councils that are trying to do? I think he has made a statement about it, hasn't he? He's now made a statement about it. I mean, I think it's tricky, you know. I think Labour nationally, it's tricky. It is actually quite tricky for them to start making national level statements about local authority about the activities of individual local authorities because it's difficult to get it to resonate beyond that place. You know, the extent to which it's happening, you know, for instance with the Haringey development vehicle, you know, which is, you know, basically selling all of the, or more or less all of the you know, the social housing and the social amenities to lend lease, you know, private company, things like the HDV and, you know, what happened at the Haygate estate in Southwark and what Southwark and Lambeth are trying to undergo in terms of demolishing estates, you know, to make way for you know, for private housing. It has limited resonance outside of London, especially up north, and so I think they're doing this sort of being on tiptoes thing where I would say that obviously politically they absolutely condemn that. You know, as individuals they would absolutely condemn that activity. But in terms of making national statements about it, it's quite tricky because, you know, because there's so much stuff, so much other stuff going on. You know, I mean, you know, like there's Brexit and so on. And there's also, I think, you know, for Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell and Diane Abbott and Emily Thornberry, you know, the list goes on. They've all got London constituencies, and so they don't want to appear to be getting sidetracked by London issues when there are so many issues of national import to be going on. And so I do sort of understand it, and I also understand. I mean, I was absolutely thrilled by Labour's manifesto because I felt that they managed. It was written by Andrew Fisher, wasn't it? Who is he their communications secretary or something like that? I can't remember. Sure. But it was written by Andrew Fisher, and I think he, you know, and Labour overall really, really successfully managed to present a really, really optimistic and entirely practicable vision of social democracy in the 21st century. And it didn't have any sniff, as far as I'm concerned, it didn't have any sniff of, you know, the 83 manifesto about it, you know, the notorious 83 manifesto, which if you read it, it does actually sound quite daft. It sounds quite good, but it also sounds a bit daft. Whereas I read this, and Owen Hatherley wrote a brilliant article about the 2017 manifesto. I can't remember, in one of these online magazine things. You know, and Owen Hatherley, you know, he basically said, you know, it's the sort of thing that brings a tear to your eye, and it brought a tear to my eye because it made the impossible seem not just realisable, but perfectly rational and perfectly kind of suited to the situation we're in right now. So God, have I really digressed there?
No, this is great.
But what I was going to say is that in Labour's 2017 manifesto, its housing policy section still basically presented home ownership as being the sort of the default mode, what everybody would want. So its first statement in the manifesto about housing was, we will make it easier to buy a house, we make it more affordable to buy a house, because ultimately that's what everybody wants to do. But then, of course, it made some really, really good statements about, you know, the necessity for greater investment in council house building, and also pointed out that, you know, if you invest in council house building, if you invest in social house building, you're investing in the country, you're investing in the housing stock, you're investing in skills, you know, because you're investing in construction skills, it's basically, it's a really important investment thing to do.
I'd heard someone say that health and safety inspectors doing house inspections, the first thing that they have to consider is the way that their decisions will impact GDP.
Yeah.
And this is because the Tories had made that their primary.
Enshrined it in legislation.
New Labour brought it in and said it has to be a consideration, but the Tories made it has to be their primary consideration.
Yeah.
How do you think this has impacted things like the social safety net and moving towards things like Grenfell, which is the kind of obvious example? This outweighing of public interest by the interest of GDP.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, I think it takes as its sort of starting point the idea that if you place, human well-being and human happiness anywhere near the centre of any sort of consideration, then you're automatically going to have a negative impact on GDP. And of course, a negative impact on GDP is totally the worst thing in the world that could ever happen. And it's interesting because, all these new sort of OBR statements have come out, haven't they, in the last week to do with the budget and all these revisions, whether or not Brexit takes this form, that form, the other form, or whatever. But it has become abundantly clear that having that absolutely mithering, penny-pinching approach to any aspect of government activity or any aspect of state activity, has to be sort of measured in pennies. It's had an absolutely shrivelling effect. If you measure anything according to, just one single bottom line, then it's clearly going to have a negative effect and unintended consequence, whether intended or otherwise, but often probably quite unintended consequences, negative consequences in other areas. If you're denying somebody of, basic benefits and rights, makes them A, too unhealthy physically and B, too depressed to function in life, then that's going to have all sorts of other economic and social costs further down the line. So it's actually a completely stupid thing to do from that end, from a more from a more sort of, I suppose, sort of conscientious or a more sort of moral point of view, why exactly does anybody ever go into politics or go into government purely and solely with the idea of saving sums of money and preventing sums of money from being spent? Whatever part of the political spectrum you're on, there is always some other reason why you're involved in it. It's not just purely to do with economics. And why you would reduce or attempt to reduce all national activity to GDP. It's just got its own internal logic. It just kind of defies logic and just sort of says that basically, the state is a giant calculator.
Right. So one of the outcomes of this, last question by the way, one of the outcomes of this has obviously been, and I just want to touch on it quickly because there's so much still being said about it, Grenfell, and I think it's important to keep that conversation going. The outcome of what I would see as the state being essentially bought by the interests of property developers and stuff like that is that you do get health and safety outcomes where people die. And as long as those policies continue, that problem is going to get worse. Is this what we saw at Grenfell, do you think?
I think what happened at Grenfell was a culmination of a number of factors, really. I suppose the ultimate thing is that people wouldn't have died in that building had the contractors been responsible. And it's obvious that the contractors did behave irresponsibly, but within the realms of that logic that I was describing before, which is that it is worth saving a few £1,000s on one thing, in order to bring the bottom line down by a few £1,000s, and completely discarding all other considerations. I mean, I think what shocked me, I went to a talk here at John Moore's about a month ago that showed that aimed to bring out some of the parallels in terms of sort of political injustice, between the Hillsborough disaster and the Grenfell disaster. And Pilgrim Tucker from the Radical Housing Network said that the Grenfell residents' own campaign to prevent what they knew was an unsafe refurbishment from taking place, basically went unreported. They blocked, they tried to prevent the contractors from coming in because they saw them putting live gas pipes up the stairwell. They saw them putting the boiler in really stupid places in the house. They knew that corners were being cut and they were basically being subject to a cowboy job. And when I say it's a sort of a culmination of factors that led to that happening in the first place and led to the fire happening, I suppose what I mean really is that you have the whole thing of Kensington and Chelsea Council basically divesting itself of its social housing through the creation of a tenant management organisation 20 years ago, which is quite a long time before most other councils did these kind of stock transfers. It goes back to the way this is quite controversial and contested, but the way tower blocks in themselves are a form of housing that have all sorts of issues, and they can be successful, but the way that they're perceived in society and the way people are allocated to tower blocks because of their sort of relative unpopularity, sort of lays bare sort of class, sort of in the landscape, it imprints class on the landscape because tower blocks are the least popular form of housing. Some people really enjoy living in them. It's not, living in a tower block isn't an automatic impediment to a happy life. Yeah. But the fact that they were built under specific sets of circumstances, namely, rapid slum clearance, a certain amount of patronage by private contractors back in the 60s, like build our newfangled tower block and we will give you we'll give the leader of the council lots of money, like those sorts of things. The fact that councils never anticipated the cost of maintaining tower blocks, which is a lot higher than just maintaining houses, because you've got to maintain the lifts, you've got to maintain the stairwells, blah blah blah. You often, usually really have to have a caretaker or concierge. All those hidden costs that weren't taken into account, and then the fact that after Ronan Point in East Ham partly fell down in the 60s, tower blocks became a really sort of a sort of the type of housing that you would try and, if you were on the waiting list and you were offered a flat in a tower block, you would often try and keep turning it down until it was the only thing that was left on offer. And there's all sorts of disadvantages associated with tower blocks that shows that people only tend to live in tower blocks, particularly over the 4th or 5th floor, if they're sort of disadvantaged in a whole other range of ways. From an ethnic minority or from a refugee or recent immigrant background. Again, if you're basically told by your council, you've got no other choice, we're not going to give you any other choices, we're not going to give you flats in more popular or lower rise estates. There's all sorts of ways in which you can be disadvantaged by it. But of course, when the actual story, the stories of the lives of the people, both who died and who survived the fire, actually sort of showed the very diverse reality, particularly of living in an area of inner London such as Ladbroke Grove, where they were living, it's people on a whole different range of incomes, doing all sorts of different jobs from all sorts of different countries, with all sorts of different family makeups, with small children, big children, working in all different parts of town, but who prior to the fire did actually come together to try and prevent that bloody refurbishment from happening in the first place. You know, and if anybody had listened to them, and if the TMO and Kensington and Chelsea Council hadn't been able to get away with it, then that, you know, everybody in that block would still be alive.
Right. Let's hope they don't actually get away with it, and that the investigation doesn't last actually as long
As the Hillsborough.
As the Hillsborough one.
Yeah.
Okay, let's leave it there. Lynsey, thank you very much.
Okay, yeah. No, thank you.